The 1960s and 70s in America was filled with lots of social change. Post-Vietnam War was a catalyst for young people of the 60s to rebel and drop out of society, forming a new counterculture in America known as hippies. This included the rejection of Western civilization, order, and the traditional values of the common middle-class citizen. The core idea of the hippie movement was that society should be freer, closer to nature, and show peace and love to others. They strongly opposed war, were for sexual liberation, and embraced non-Christian faith. They strived for pleasurable personal freedom and frequently protested for their beliefs, sending messages to the general public.
There was no doubt the hippies' actions were considered a revolution. Morals that American society had prior to the 60s were being terminated in many ways. It definitely became common for a young adult to be kicked out of their own home. Because of the hippies' way of life wouldn't match their parents, hippies with similar values moved to communities called communes, where they could live together in peace. One of the biggest communes was one in San Francisco named the Haight-Ashbury District, where thousands of hippies lived. Known as the Summer of Love, the summer of 1967 was considered a social phenomenon, where up to 100,000 converged into the hippie lifestyle in Haight-Ashbury. This counterculture movement came farther and farther into public awareness, causing ordinary citizens to question everything and anything about how and where they lived.
Music was super big among hippies. Many attended large music festivals. Artists that were popular in the psychedelic scene in the 60s includes Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, and more. Many of these new groups combined their rock and roll rhythms with meaningful lyrics about their hopes and fears of the new generation and the widening of cultural gaps between them and their parents. Along with their entertaining music, several protest songs came about. Music at the time was very important to hippies because it was one of the most defining factors of their culture and it brought them all together. One way the hippies came together was the Woodstock Music Festival. The first one was held in New York in 1969. With the fast, energetic beats, the style of dancing had changed dramatically. Opposed to the dancing of their parents' generation, hippies in these years danced alone and didn't worry about how others saw them. They just wanted to feel free. Big events like these are not easily ignored by the media, and at a certain point, it was impossible to not draw attention to the hippie movement, a new cultural revolution.
Sex is just much groovier when there's love, There's a lot more happening, but there's nothing wrong with just sex for sex.
A belief that came about during the hippie era was the idea of free love. This was a social movement that rejected marriage and based their sexual decisions on what felt right. Free love claimed that a person's relationship, the use of birth control, and adultery should only concern the people involved and no one else. Concepts that were part of the free love phenomenon included preventing gender roles, personal pleasure, and for women to use their body in any way she wants. A popular saying by hippies at this time was,
"If it feels good, man, you just gotta do it."
Now everyone repeat after me. If it feels good, do it.
At first, there were just a small number of activists who didn't approve of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, starting at Berkeley College in California in 1965. But by 1968, there were several anti-war marches, student strikes, sit-ins, and other protests that became prominent among the nation. The counterculture preached love and not war, so they took action by protesting. Eventually, some of the protests became progressively violent when National Guards had to come in to settle or stop them. There were cases of bombings, arson, vandalism, and even the shootings of innocent hippies. In 1974, the last American troops were sent home from Vietnam, and naturally, the protests began to end, the hippie counterculture coming to a quiet close.
Years later, when newcomers started to join this movement, they did not know the original intent of the counterculture when it first began and just went along with the outward signs of defiance presented, such as headbands, cowboy boots, long hair, and the use of LSD and marijuana. Essentially, the newer youth saw hippies as a fashion statement or a fad rather than a cultural revolution. In conclusion, the early 1960s held a common vision of a man in a gray flannel suit who worked in an office and lived a boring, colorless life. and there would be a manicured housewife and a neat suburban home for him to come home to. The youth at the time wanted to break the stereotypes and roles of the average American citizen by expanding in fashion choices, new types of music, and being involved in heavy illegal drug use.
You could see somebody across the street, and if they had long hair, you knew how they thought. You knew that they were into good music. You knew that they were into a reasonable life. You knew that their thought processes. You knew that they probably hated the government. You knew that they probably knew where the best drugs were. You knew that it was someone that you could just nod to and have this understanding between.